Hello and welcome to the Wednesday, May 23rd edition of Cluster API under SIG Cluster Lifecycle. We'll get started here. There's an attending spot if folks want to drop their name and the company they work for and get their extra credit points, and then I'll jump into the agenda here. Looks like Robert Bailey has the first agenda item. Revisiting moving cloud provider specific code out of the repo. Issue number 152. Looks like we have something in chat. Oh, Chris says bad things happen when he tries to record. Okay, so issue 152, we had brought this up a while ago, which was, I think got a lot of good feedback on it, but I think it kind of got off in the weeds a little bit, which was the ongoing discussion of whether or not we ultimately want to move cloud provider specific code, also known as actuator code, out of the cluster API repository. And if so, like, what does that whole process look like, or what does the timeline look like there? Looks like going off of the GitHub thumbs up voting, we had a slightly larger trend in the idea of moving the code out of the repository, but we got quite a bit of pushback on possibly doing that anytime in the near future. I think most folks were kind of in agreement that it made sense to sort of have a reactive posture here and actually take on that burden of work as soon as it started causing more problems than it was solving for us in real time. If anybody has anything else they want to add to that, I'm okay with kind of writing a quick follow-up and calling those items out and closing the issue, so we at least have it documented, but now is a good chance for anybody to voice any concerns if that does not sound like something that they agree with. Going once, going twice. Okay, so lazy consensus dictates we all agree it's a good idea to move it out. We just don't want to introduce more work until we're necessarily ready for it. Cool, that one was easy. Next up, Daniel, is there a proposal for managing multiple masters server-side? Last discussion appears to be from February 28th meeting. Did M. Mason post his master deployment proposal? Any more information on this agenda item would be helpful.
Oh, go ahead.
Master deployments yet, or like managing multiple masters. So there hasn't been any progress at least from our side.
Okay, sorry, it's a little hard to hear, but
I was saying that we haven't actually made a lot of progress on managing multiple masters. So there really are no updates from our side on that.
okay. I remember listening to the recording and I thought there might be something posted on, but I didn't find anything on Slack or in the agenda, so I just wanted to follow up.
Okay. Anything else on that issue?
Is that work that that we want to work on later, or is that something that we want to be taken up and it's just there's nobody to take it up?
What is there an issue for this work anywhere?
I'm not sure if anyone's working on this right now.
Okay. All right, I can file an issue and go from there.
Okay, that would be a good starting point. Cool. Looks like you have the next one as well. Proposal, actuator that works with machines already provisioned with an operating system. Actuator would expect IP hostname in the machine spec and use SSH. Useful for bare metal in the absence of PXE or iPXE or other infrastructure APIs. This is a great one.
Yeah, that's something that, so this is something that we're at Platform 9 interested in working on. If it's a, an internal use case for us, but I just wanted to see if it's something that would be useful upstream, and if so, I'll file an issue, and then I'll start with a PR.
I can say that from Samsung's perspective, we are interested in this, and I don't know if Justin Santa Barbara is on the line, but I think he did some of this work in COPS. Maybe Chris Nova remembers better, but.
Yeah, Justin had some bare metal work in COPS. Last I looked at the source code, which was ages ago. I know that myself and other folks are also interested in some sort of API-less bare metal implementation of the cluster API. I think that the two things here, you kind of hit on one of them. Let's open up an issue and kind of keep our scope small and talk about what we are thinking here. And then I think the other thing that we have to concern ourselves with is what Robert Bailey just mentioned, which is how do we handle potential, because this is basically going to be a new cloud provider, right? Which is how do we handle creating new ones in the repository moving forward? So I think maybe calling out both of those in the issue and we can start there would be a good first start.
Yeah, one question I would ask is, you have a proposal to do this. Is there anything with the current API that would prevent you from doing exactly this using the provider config blob? Or are you just looking for some consensus around what you'd want to put in the provider config blob and how to implement that?
That's part of it. We haven't fleshed out completely what the provider config would look like. Part of the I think it seems feasible to do. Most of this is going to be sort of opaque to the controller, but I think what Kris mentioned about how feasible is it for us to write this the controller and the deployer tool and then have it live outside of the repo. I've been running into some issues just building it sort of separately. So that's why I wanted to ask that here. So it's a question of I guess building and where does the code live, and if maybe once I file the issue, it would be great if I could ask for some help on getting this controller written and maybe having the code live outside in a different repo.
Yeah, I'm gonna put Tim on the spot since I see his lovely face on the call here, sort of representing the steering committee / SIG architecture. If we do want to have the code outside of the API repo, the Kubernetes SIGs organization in GitHub, we should be able to create a new Git repo under that for sort of this new machine actuator, right? Sort of underneath the SIG cluster lifecycle mandate without too much sort of overhead in terms of getting repos approved, I would think.
The idea.
So Tim was pretty soft. I think he said that's the idea. So assuming that that's correct, I think what we want to do is we should create one of those for the GCP one also, even if we are not in a huge rush to move it out. But if you're having trouble getting the code to compile and stuff, maybe that should force us to move our code out sooner and help sort of solve those problems also, right? Because if we're not feeling that pain, then we're less incentivized to help you fix the problem for yourself. And we don't want to slow you down.
So in the name of moving actuator-specific code out of the cluster API repository, are we thinking a new repository for every cloud, or are we thinking one monolithic repository of all the clouds, but none of the common code?
I would say new one for every cloud. I mean, Tim, do you want to jump in and?
Yeah, I
give your
can
opinion
hear
there?
you better.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. I think a repo for every cloud makes more sense from a lot of reasons, but if for no other reason than getting out of the way of people who are doing independent work independently. In the hindsight of the general cloud controller manager work in Kubernetes, having a Mondo repo that has code from a bunch of different providers just turned into a nightmare as the number of providers got close to 10. I can't even imagine what it would be like beyond that.
Okay.
So yeah, I think there's also some arguments around having sort of a single binary built from a single GitHub repo is really nice in terms of working with Go. We certainly don't want to have to deal with vendor dependency conflicts or anything if you start putting them all into a Mondo repo. There's a lot of maintenance that goes down. There's maintenance that goes up in terms of managing multiple repos, but the Kubernetes organization is already sort of dealing with that. And I think we have much better tools in place to deal with N repositories than we do to deal with one repository with N tools inside of it.
Wow.
Is there a plan to, so let's say we have cloud provider GC, such a repo. can we host the Cloud Controller Manager and this cluster API stuff in the same repo? Or do we need like 2 repos per cloud for 2 different purposes, both the Cloud Controller Manager that is running on top of Kubernetes and this cluster API thing?
So the cool thing about it being independent repos for independent teams is they can make that decision on their own. I see no reason why we couldn't have them be in the same repo. Presumably those sorts of controllers are going to share some amount of code and some amount of dependencies, so it makes sense. And then it just becomes, Google's problem to solve the build for Google and Amazon's problem to solve the build for Amazon, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the answer is if they want to, and we should encourage people to do that, but we shouldn't necessarily require it.
Yeah, like in particular, the networking team has been doing a lot of work building libraries to talk to GCP to make the Ingress controller more testable. And it'd be nice if we could just use those libraries instead of having to build them ourselves.
Okay. I mean, I think we're all shaking our heads here in agreement. This sounds like a great plan. Anyway, to go back to the original question here, Daniel, if you want guidance with the controller, if you need help getting a new repository set up, I have strong opinions on bare metal implementation. I'm happy to share those. I'm sure there's a lot of other folks here you can rally as well. And I can help you, and other folks in the SIG can as well.
Yeah, I guess the one thing about setting up new repositories that I'll sort of echo from yesterday's SIG meeting is that we don't want to set up new repositories that only have a single owner, right? We want to make sure that we have an owners list that is sort of multiple people, ideally from multiple sort of companies, right? So we sort of have a shared responsibility for maintenance. And so, and also, Tim St. Clair suggested that we sort of take a Highlander approach where we don't set up 3 new repositories for sort of 3 different bare metal solutions. And then we try to converge and have people work together, because otherwise the maintenance burden becomes much, much higher for the SIG.
Okay. Is there documentation anywhere or a good story on what it would look like to get a new repository set up that we know of from the broader SIG? Okay.
No, not that I know of. I think you didn't have too much trouble setting up the cluster API one, right? I
mean, I just walked over and was like, hey, Tim, give me a repo.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should, there is one, I think right now for cloud provider-GCP.
Okay.
That's where the cloud provider code eventually is going to move to. So we can either try to move the GCP machine controller in there, or we can create one for machine controller GCP that's separate. And, again, as Tim mentioned, like we as sort of the Google maintainers will need to figure out how to structure those. And whether they live in the Kubernetes org or whether they live in like a Google Cloud Platform org is sort of another question we're trying to decide. Okay. And some of that goes through legal and is out of our control.
Understood.
So for bare metal, if that is really a community-built, community-supported implementation, we should stick it under Kubernetes SIGs and just create a repo. And it sounds like we have at least multiple people that are interested in maintaining that. So I don't think there's the conversation yesterday was there was sort of one person who wanted to be the primary owner, and that was concerning to Tim in terms of long-term maintenance.
Yeah, it makes sense. Okay. Any other questions on bare metal implementation, repositories, broader architecture?
Sounds like Slack is the place to reach out, and I'll file an issue initially.
Yep.
Yes.
All right. Thanks a lot.
I'll just say I'm very excited that you're starting to build bare metal, because that sounds really cool. So I'm happy to see progress there.
All right.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next agenda item if we don't have anything else. Adding support for custom static pods using a config map to map control plane version to pod specs, issue number 198.
Hi, so that's my issue that I created. This is to add support, as you said, for using custom static pods. This would be an alternative to using the default pod specs that kubeadm and init creates. This is kind of for power users who want more flexibility and control over setting up their control plane. My initial idea was to use this config map that would have a control plane version specified, and then it would give you back these pod specs that you put in. The machine controller would handle grabbing these files and putting them into the manifests folder for the kubelet to start. And then if the machine controller doesn't see that this config map exists, then it would just assume that the user wants to use kubeadm init to just start it up like a default cluster. So if anyone had any like comments or concerns, questions, bring them up here or just like post them on the issue.
So are you looking to write all of the static pod contents yourself, or do you look to put kubeadm configuration in that config map?
You mean like the actual contents of like those files that would be in the config map?
Okay, so you would then overwrite everything that
Yeah.
kubeadm would do.
Yeah, so like it would, like for kubeadmin, you could split up the steps that it executes, and then like one of the steps is to set up the control plane, and that's where it generates these manifests. So if this config map is present, then instead of running that step, it would be using the files that are in the config map. And if there is no config map, it would just run the whole kubeadmin init steps.
Okay, so why do you don't use the kubeadm configuration file for this, or write after kubeadm init, just write them like the kubelets will start the static pods as well?
I think it's just more like for flexibility. I don't know whether there's an option for, I haven't really looked into it, I guess, for how kubeadmin init, or like if you could just give kubeadmin init files that you want to run instead. I thought that was just like you would not run that step, but run the other steps in it instead.
There are multiple options, but yeah.
Yeah.
You can either like give the kubeadm config, the kubeadm configuration file. You can specify what kind of setup you want. And one of the things I might want to talk about later as an agenda item is how we can make the kubeadm config and cluster API config converge eventually. But yeah, right as it stands, you can override arguments, for example, for the API server to run. If you want, you can't give pre-made files, but the point of kubeadm is to like enforce security defaults and stuff, so that it generates these for free for you.
Okay. Yeah, I'll look into using the config file for that too.
Yeah. From what I recall, kubeadm allows you to add extra args. It doesn't allow you to override certain arguments. I mean, I guess you could like play around, like those are technically appended to the end of the argument list and override.
They are overriding what kubeadm would do. Okay.
But this would definitely be meant as like a look aside for power users who know what they are doing. And this is something that if Google, like us, we're proposing just to do this for us. We're not saying this is going to be for everyone. And it's purely optional because we do want to support using kubeadm too. But if we like ever wanted to offer this as a service, we have some other auditing requirements. Like we need to like know exactly what specs are running, and it's difficult to rely on kubeadm to generate those specs. And like the idea would be kubeadm may be the generator of those specs, but we would be in charge of like auditing them and placing them and making sure that they stay up to date with what we want, or applying slight patches we may need in a programmatic manner without having to go through kubeadm or rework them. It's not meant for the common end user. It's meant for like people who already know what they're doing and want to provide this service en masse.
Okay, so it's more like this. You generate, for example, a configuration file using kubeadm, the phase or whatever, then you check it in somewhere, audit, then you use this config map to actually put it on the master.
Yeah, a workflow like that. And the thing, I think we just wanted to let people know that we might be going in this direction, and we wanted to also state that this is completely optional. Like we still want to support the standard kubeadm workflow.
Cool.
Okay. Katie, did you get everything you need on that issue? Cool.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks.
Okay. Moving on. Lucas how do we converge kubeadm to the cluster API configuration? I was going to kind of mention this earlier. Tim St. Clair pinged me offline, said that you guys talked about something or other for 1.12. Any more info would be helpful.
So basically, the current configuration file you give to kubeadm init has grown organically, and it's like just this one big slice with a lot of fields. Basically looks like many of our other components before refactoring. So we're doing that refactoring now. The first thing we're doing is remove all things we don't need there, and then splitting like those things that are one-offs when you do kubeadm init, and those things who should be like persisted inside of a cluster for reconciliation. And those things that are specified, like that should be generic for the cluster and be somewhere in the cluster for reconciliation, is basically also going to be the same thing as you're doing with the cluster spec. And we want these to converge so that once you write your cluster spec, it's going to work with any kubeadm init, but it's also going to work with any other, like, whatever you like pass it to GKE, for example, and that's going to be translated into the right commands. So I pasted a Google Doc file here, and there we have like just a kind of brain dump of how it could look like. So please go in there and look. In the meeting, like just before here, like some minutes ago, 25 minutes ago, I went through all these fields and we talked about whether they make sense or not. So you can also watch the recording of the meeting previously. But what are the general thoughts? And so I checked the current cluster spec is basically just provider config and some networking. What are the plans to make that more sophisticated, or are there?
I think, and Robert, keep me honest here. I think our plan was to try to keep the original cluster spec as minimal as possible and only introduce fields kind of in a reactive sense where we needed them one at a time slowly.
Right, and so I would expect that the kubeadm config in that sense would be a superset of the cluster API config, because the cluster API definition we try to keep small, and then the actuator, when you actually are deploying that in an environment, generate the kubeadm config and sort of fill in the pieces that made sense for that environment, right?
Yeah. So for example, things we have right now in the cluster spec are like, so the networking parts are shared, they're common between these two. Then we also have config like, okay, what org should be passed to the API server? Right now, this is a string map that is translated to flags, which is unbelievably like, we really want to use component configuration, but that is not available because no one is working on that. And that is a general goal we want to work with the other SIGs to actually execute on, because using flags for the configuration is not optimal. But yeah, that's the stopgap we have. Like, these are the flags that should be passed to the API server, other than what's generated by default. As we said, we have like, what is the Kubernetes version in the cluster spec? Is that something you've talked about, like including, or is it out of scope for the cluster API?
The cluster API right now does have a field for the control plane version, as well as a field on machines for the kubelet version. So that is there at the moment. Okay, I just looked at in the wrong place then. Cool. Then we have, so are you gonna treat masters like normal nodes, like machines, or do you gonna treat them differently in any way? So if you look at the API, it has a notion of a role that can be set to master or node, or both. And I think, if I'm recalling the documentation correctly, if you set the role to node, it will register into a cluster. If you set it to master and node, it will register itself into the cluster. And if you set it to just master, it will run the control plane, but not register the kubelet into that control plane. Does that make sense?
No, it does register. It just taints the master, and
Okay.
it's not schedulable, or not
Okay. So,
unless you tolerate that taint.
Okay, so it's more like what kubeadm does for the master than what
Yeah.
GP does for the master. Okay. We have been having some discussions about whether those roles make sense, because I think Kubernetes in general is moving away from this notion of masters and nodes. We aren't sure we want to encode that in the control plane. I think both Tim and Brian have given feedback to that degree, and so we're trying to think about what we can do to modify the API to take those out. So yeah, we're still brainstorming, but expect something coming soon to rip this out.
Is there any more documentation on this notion to move away from masters and nodes, just for context?
I don't know about documentation, but there's a lot of work that's being done recently, and not even recently, about either self-hosting or using clusters to manage other clusters, or breaking up the control plane to the extent that most of it is just stuff running in the cluster, such that sort of the idea of a role sort of feels antiquated. And I'm reluctant to encode it into a brand new API if we can find a better way of expressing it. Taints are sort of there, but not quite perfect. I would like to encourage, and I'm just coming up to speed on all the cluster API stuff, so I apologize if some of this has been discussed before. I would like to encourage that we think about a different way to represent the concept that we're trying to capture by role, whether that's security or access control or privilege levels or machine auto credentials, or what does it actually mean, and if there's a better way that we can represent those things.
Yeah, I think it was originally stuck there because it meant run a different startup script, right? Effectively, right? That was the key for run different startup script, and maybe that's not the right way to represent that.
Exactly, right? Like that seems like an orthogonal concept to what am I?
Yes. I think, Tim, if I recall correctly, you also sent out an email a while back saying we shouldn't be using master, we should be talking about the control plane, right? And this again is, we're encoding the notion of a master. And the control plane is something that's actually sort of growing over time, right? Historically, the control plane is the API server, the scheduler, and controller manager. But as we do the cloud controller manager work to split that out, as we start looking at extension API servers, which the cluster API has, right, the control plane actually is sort of growing and may not actually all reside on a single machine. A lot of people run etcd outside of the same machine as the master, and other people run it on the same machine. So the notion of a master that looks exactly the same, that you can stamp out exact replicas of, is also potentially an antiquated concept at this point. And trying to use that role thing to encode all the different variations of how you might want to deploy the control plane software across machines is going to get overly complex pretty quickly.
And certainly there's some systemic problems across Kubernetes itself about version skew and testing across versions, but really in practice, there's really not much difference between the kube controller manager and the Nginx ingress controller. They're both control plane components that are reacting to the creation and deletion of resources in the API. So should we be treating those things fundamentally differently, or should we just be worrying about maybe we want a couple of versions more tightly for some components than other components?
Okay, I mean, it makes sense. I think removing implications is always a good idea whenever possible. So
also, less API is more better.
Yeah, you can say that again.
Yeah, so I think the API service is the hard part. Like, where is the different? So as a user, I want to know where are my API endpoints running, and then the other, because that's gonna that's gonna have to be basically fed into all the other clients that are talking to them. So if we don't have some kind of load balancer, and then we don't need that, then we do need some other field that is, here is the aggregated place for every client to talk to the API service. So I think when thinking about master and node, I would say the API server is the most important part. And if we could say, like, like right now, a master is where the API server is running. And I mean, that's not a good general definition, but if we at least could distinguish, this is some kind of more mastery node, and this is more a normal node that might be running an extension API server, or like even a controller manager, but it doesn't API server.
I agree at the point of where the central API server is pretty important. It is sort of the linchpin of building up the stack of things. I sort of disagree about whether there's a master-ish thing, because I don't really know what master-ish means. And it means different things to different installations. For some people, it means you're not allowed to SSH to this machine. For other people, it means that the machine image is going to be a different image. And I don't like encoding that as sort of an intrinsic part of the identity. I would much rather think of it in terms of what are you actually trying to express about it? What makes something master-ish?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
I don't have a perfect answer for you, honestly, right? I saw that field and I sort of had a reaction to it. So I'm encouraging you guys to think about it, but I don't have a great answer for you yet.
Yeah, me neither. But having something, at least distinguishing something that runs an API server and something that don't, I think would be useful for this API, whether we call the master node or like API server node, whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, going beyond that, even having the concept that a machine is what runs the control plane might be breaking some of the work that's being done right now with people having a control plane for one cluster running as just a deployment in another cluster.
Yeah.
And so trying to model even that case as a machine is a little off. So there's probably a better place for it. And we should have ongoing discussions about how to model that. But the master concept definitely does not represent that case well. And the machine concept doesn't even represent that case well. At best, it's a misnomer. At worst, it's a complete mismatch.
All right, so we've rattled on this for a little while. Lucas, were there other fields as you scanned down through your document that were worth calling out that you thought maybe had a dissonance between the cluster API spec and the kubeadm beta API?
Also, we're not sure yet how to handle etcd, but that is probably the other hard part. So I think what we're gonna do is like co-locate etcd together. So either you do all external, like you just set the API server flags like this is my external etcd and here are the certs. But if we do want to support something within kubeadm init and join master something, then we're gonna co-locate the API server and the etcd on the same machine. And we haven't decided how the API server is gonna talk to etcd, if it's gonna talk on localhost or to all of them directly. In either case, we need something that, where should we put etcd? And then we also need to think about like, how do we upgrade these things and configure them? So that is something we have in the kind of proposal or brain dump in the kubeadm specs right now, but also trying to think about that in the cluster API minimal sense. Is there some kind of representation we should be doing there? Should we like, again, have some other role for etcd or like, here is the database backend that people can talk to, or should it just be completely orthogonal to the API?
Yeah, the initial concept of roles was meant to be expandable, so it could include things like master maybe implies you have etcd, but you could also set a role for etcd. As we're trying to figure out how to maybe back away from this notion of role, there needs to be a different way to represent etcd. But that was sort of where we were headed. Looking at the spec you have for etcd, is that meant to be, you say, here's my configuration for external etcd, and then I run kubeadm, and it configures API server to talk to it. And if I'm using a local etcd, kubeadm is responsible for upgrading etcd to the right version based on what's specified in the local etcd struct? Or does
yes.
It not? Okay. So if it's local etcd,
kubeadm is going to treat it as co-located with the master. And when we do upgrade, like do kubeadm upgrade apply, it's going to upgrade etcd first, and then the masters. The thing is, like, we might want to do things like only upgrade etcd first. So you do upgrade etcd on master 1, upgrade etcd on master 2 and 3, and then upgrade the rest of the control plane. We don't have a clear answer whether or what to support in that context. Or in the cluster API context, it might be, okay, well, let's delete this first machine that is a master or whatever control plane endpoint that hosts both etcd and the API server, and create a new one that is fresh to join the set. Or if we want to do in-place upgrades, because it's going to, I don't know how well we do test that either, as Tim said, like versions queue testing in HA mode. I have no idea how good that is. So we have like all the API servers 110. We in place upgrade one API server to 111. Is that going to break the clients talking randomly via load balancer to the API servers if we hit the 111 or 110? Such things are hard to get right, and we don't have a clear answer yet, I guess.
Back to etcd, in the spec you have, I don't see any word that it has version. So are we saying that the version of etcd is implicit based on the version of Kubernetes that kubeadm is upgrading you to?
Right now it is, yes. But if you do want to override that, you can set the image yourself.
But if I set the image myself, then I can easily shoot myself in the foot, right? Because unless kubeadm is parsing that image and understands how to do data migration between etcd versions, it's probably not going to do the right thing, right?
Is there a comment? Yeah, so the only thing we at this moment is really support is like, okay, we know that for Kubernetes 111, we're doing etcd 3.2 whatever. And if we upgrade to 112, we might go to 3.3 something. And for that, like in-place upgrade should be just enough. Like just taking a snapshot of whatever, storing it, and then just restarting with the same data directory, a newer etcd server, which does internally does the conversation or conversion. And only after all the peers are upgraded, it's going to change schema internally, talking with the peers. That is the current way we're doing it. Doing stuff like upgrading from etcd 3 to etcd 4 we don't have such code right now, because we don't know what that's going to look like.
That's more of the best case. I know that Justin has mentioned multiple times that the 2 to 3 migration has been very difficult to implement in COPS. And I want to, I think all of the little minor bumps, etcd just kind of takes your old data and moves forward. But on the major bumps, I think we actually had to run migration scripts. And in HA, Clayton was saying that Red Hat, took down the entire etcd cluster, upgraded everything, and then brought it back up. And so you end up with some downtime, even for your HA deployments. And it sounded like it required quite a bit of additional orchestration. So it sounds like we're not quite worried about that yet, because we don't see etcd 4 looming on the horizon. Yeah,
exactly. If we ever have that scenario, we're gonna build in custom code in kubeadm to like deal with it if we can. We don't know, but to make it seamless. Otherwise, we just have to like say run this script or run these like migration steps manually.
Okay. I want to move forward if that's okay. We've been down this rat hole for quite a few minutes. I'll leave the Kubicorn demo comments for the end. Kris, we'll skip right to you. Repo permissions. What is going on there?
Yeah, I'm just going through and noting. So the SIG's org is a bit different. as I've noticed with Kenny's latest joining of the org, I expected that to give us like permissions to assign him issues, but it turns out he needs the Kubernetes org is different from the Kubernetes SIGs org, and it looks like they've kept the Kubernetes SIGs org potentially small. So what we had to do was add him as a collaborator on the cluster API repo itself. And as an admin, I had that privilege, and it seemed like that had been done for a lot of other people who were committing on it. But I also noticed that a lot of people have write permissions. So I think that is a bad situation to be in. This is why we have all this automation around PR management to enable that. So this is just kind of a heads up. Everyone who has write permissions now, I am probably going to revert you to read. I'm going to leave the 3 or 4 admins we have, that includes you, Chris Nova, by the way, as admins, just as fallbacks. And if people notice issues like they need to do something that they couldn't before, we may temporarily revert you back to a write permission while we figure out a best way to solve this, because having people having write access to this repo is unmaintainable, and also having to manually add people as collaborators to this is unmaintainable. But that needs to be a longer term solution that works with, I think, across Kubernetes SIGs. But I just wanted to bring that up.
Okay. And to be clear, this isn't implying that we're taking away anybody's ability to do something. We're just changing the avenue in which you do it.
Yes, I'm removing, I think this will remove abilities to create new labels, abilities to direct commit to the repo, and all that stuff. You should still be able to send PRs. You should be able to assign PRs. You should be able to be assigned to PRs and be able to do all the / commands you still have. This is removing GitHub UI interactions. And again, if you notice issues, please at me, Chris Nova, or Robert Bailey in this channel, and can I ask you guys to help try to resolve this? I want to do this quickly, but I recognize it may cause issues. Also, I'm going on vacation after Friday, so I won't be around next week to help solve this. Are you two okay with doing that?
Yeah, that sounds great. I
Yeah.
think for the most part, hopefully people don't need write access to do anything productive. And we will quickly find out if they do.
Yeah. I think the biggest issue is there's no way to like create labels or milestones for people who like to manage those. But we need a better solution for that anyway too. Are you raising your hand, Lucas?
Yeah, so I was just thinking, do we have an application form or a process for being a member of the Kubernetes SIGs organization? Because I think that's a requirement for being able to do / commands. So can we say something like everyone that is a member in the core Kubernetes organization can join using this whatever process, the Kubernetes SIGs org, or do we have to have a separate mailing list for joining the Kubernetes SIGs organization, like the Kubernetes membership mailing list we have?
I don't think there's a process for that. I'm not that familiar. I'm going to punt this to Tim if he wants to comment on it, but things I've noticed so far is like the Kubernetes SIGs list of members is like 6 people, and they seem to have kept it intentionally small. And it's also prevented us from like using Kubernetes org teams to like reference. Like I would like to pull in like SIG networking on an issue, but I can't in this repo, and it's kind of a bummer.
Yeah, I'm just looking right now. There are 5 people in the Kubernetes SIGs organization, 5 individuals, and there are no teams. And none of the people on this call, I believe, are in there, including Tim. But we are all able to use all the / commands by being collaborators on this one repository.
Yeah, so I don't know what the plan is there, actually. It's a really good question. I know that cross-org group expansions just isn't something GitHub supports. So I think we're just crap out of luck there. I don't know why we would want to apply different rules with respect to org membership for SIGs than for the main organization. I think it's probably a case of not having procedure in place for it, and not that we don't want to actually do it the right thing. If somebody wants to follow up, maybe pop off a note to steering and just ask, was this intentional or a side effect of nobody getting around to doing it?
I was just more thinking, like, do we need one process or do we envision having many? So like let's say we have Kubernetes core, and then we have Kubernetes client, and then we have Kubernetes SIGs, and then we have like whatever Kubernetes sub-org. Do we want to have n different membership applications for the people, or do we have one mailing list? Here is what I've done. Here is the organization I want to join. In this case, both Kubernetes and Kubernetes SIGs.
Yeah, so I think the answer is partial. I think Kubernetes and Kubernetes SIGs want to have the same policies. I don't know for other organizations that we may create in the future that those will necessarily follow the same rules. Like clients is a little bit more guarded because it is not a sort of open development space. It's a more purpose-built org. So there is a PR or proposal, no PR in flight from Eric Veda, I think, to add declarative GitHub org management, where you pull the org definitions and team memberships and all those things from a YAML file, and a bot updates the actual GitHub orgs, which would allow us to synchronize Kubernetes and Kubernetes SIGs. I think that's the intention there. It's not quite done yet. But I think, Lucas, what you're asking, like, do we want one process, is a fair question. I think that's something we should just get clarity on from the larger steering group and decide if we want to do something in the short term or if we just want to wait for this PR to land.
Cool.
Cool. Any other questions on repository permissions and GitHub orgs? Okay. The last thing is I did do a demo of a cluster API controller with Kubicorn, not last week, the week before, when I was out of town. We lost the recording because of technical difficulties. I presented it yesterday at OpenStack. I'm not sure if it was recorded. If it was recorded, I'll just put a link and we can go from there. If that's not the case, I'll jump aside and spend 30 minutes in the conference room and just do a quick recording, and I'll add it to the links here. But if there's anything anybody wants to see specifically, feel free to ping me, and I'm happy to show that one when I go through the demo. And if nobody has anything else.
Just wanted to shortly mention something on the TF deployer. And Terraform deployer as user, no worries, as a user potential developer, what's the current state? What's ongoing there? I see in the README there's mostly not yet supported. Is there like a timeline? Just also for potential contribution, does it make sense now? Is there ongoing work which will be merged soon? What's the general, what's ongoing there?
I can speak to that a little bit. It is ongoing work. We're playing around with it to validate some of our use cases to make sure that we don't do anything like Google was doing this, to make sure we don't do anything GCP specific and stuff like that. It's still in a pretty rough state. For instance, I just submitted a PR, I think yesterday, that enabled delete. Like you can delete a machine with it now, and that wasn't there before. So it's still in a fairly rough state, and I have no timeline on it, and I'm not sure if we're committing to any timelines with that in regard. But
the current contributors are only Googlers, right?
Yeah, I think the only two people who have committed Go to, or serious Go to it, are me and Karan.
Okay.
I know we had a few reservations about packaging the binary in the repository. So I'm not sure what happened there. I remember there's a pull request out to remove it. There's also been talk about trying to use Terraform as a library and not actually wrapping the binary and doing a system exec. So there might be some opinions there as well as you start to poke around at it.
All right. Thank you. Can I feel free to contact you afterward, Kris, just out of short email or something? It's fine.
Yeah, you can send out a short email. Fair warning, I'm pretty busy this week, and I'm going on vacation next week. But I'll try to at least give you at least a high-level overview and reply to your questions.
On the plans. Thank you very much.
All right.
Anything else? Going once? Twice? All right, have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, Kris.